May the Lord give you his peace. We're now beginning class 6. And in this class, we're going to be talking about the social and religious climate in the time of St. Francis. It's important for us to reflect upon what was going on around Francis if we're going to understand him in his own time and how he was formed by the culture that surrounded him. So we're going to look at now the society, which was in a critical phase. So the Holy Roman Empire was beginning to crack. The commonality was made up of a new social class of the merchants and the craftsmen. It was no longer just the feudal lords and the serfs. You know, we had this new civic democratic spirit that was sweeping through Europe. There was a new money-based economy. So bartering was going out of style. No longer were they bartering, your milk for your wheat. You were actually paying for it with cash. And so that threatened the land tenure. So there was a new ethical standard and religious requirements were beginning to come out in the culture. So beyond the Alps, the new nation states were emerging. And this was incompatible with the unity of Christian civilization. So they were clashing between the papacy and the empire, and things were getting very difficult. And so there was a real offense against the main bastion of unity. So there was this emergence of a new people with a new culture. There was a development of the Romance languages, replacing Latin in public life and in public literature. And so for St. Francis, he grows up being able to speak the Umbrian dialect, but he also knows Latin because he has to use that in school and so forth. Any public writings have to be in Latin. But then all of a sudden is emerging the Italian, and now has this third language out there. And when he writes, they say that he kind of confuses some of his Latin with his Umbrian dialect and his Italian, so he also spoke French because his mother was from Picardy, France. And so he had another language there that kind of threw him off a little bit. Interesting to note, though, that if you're studying Italian literature, they tell me that one poem that you have to learn is St. Francis's Canticle of Creatures. And it's interesting as to why. Because it was the first poem, they say, that was written in Italian. So Francis made a great historic impact on the culture by actually writing something poetic, something beautiful as he did, the Canticle of Creatures, in the actual Italian language. First thing they say written in Italian. So this was part of Francis's cultural experience, we could say. So St. Francis links these two eras and reflects the contrast of that century of transition from the old to the new. He's standing right there in the middle, of the two, holding the, it's a little tension between the two, the old and the new. So there arose these obscure reformers with the principles of a return to the gospel. So before even Francis comes on the scene, there's already this renewal. There's this fire going around Europe of this desire to return to the Gospels, return to the early life, return to the way Christianity was lived in the time of the apostles. And so there's this new rising of this gospel poverty. So before Francis was actually living gospel poverty, there was also already this movement going on in the culture among the Catholics of wanting to embrace a more radical form of poverty, that dependence upon divine providence. That they were not going to hold common goods privately, but in common. That there was a commitment to brotherhood, that sense of fraternity, as we find in the early church. Now, it's important to note that, in the time of the monks, prior to Francis and the Mendicant Orders, you didn't take a vow of poverty. You took a vow of obedience, you took a vow of stability, and you took a vow of conversion of manners. The vow of chastity and the vow of poverty was covered underneath the vow of obedience, because in the old system, you could not marry or own anything without your father's permission. And so when you entered a monastery, you had the abbot, the father, who didn't allow you to marry because of the vow of chastity, and you couldn't own anything because of the vow of poverty. All things were held in common by the monastery, and you lived poor, dependent upon the monastery. When St. Francis begins his order, he doesn't introduce the vow of poverty. It was already kind of there, but he really makes it something very common, the vow of poverty, which eventually becomes part of the life of the church itself. So let's look at some of these groups that were out there prior to Francis. The first we look at is the Waldensians. They originated in Lyon. They were approved by Pope Alexander III in 1179. And they were permitted to take the vow of poverty. But they were forbidden to preach without the permission of the diocesan bishop. And they were not too obedient to this directive. So they were told not to preach, and they did anyway, which got them in trouble. Now, they also popularized the scriptures in the vernacular. Now, I have to say that was not a problem. It just wasn't common because you didn't have a vernacular really at that time. There was a transition, as I was mentioning, to the Romance languages. Everything was in Latin. Everything in the public square was in Latin. And all of a sudden you have this development of Romance languages. There's a couple of movies done on the life of St. Francis. One is with Mickey Rourke, and the other one was made, an Italian film about 10 or so years ago. And in both these films, they have people being tortured because they had the Gospels in the vernacular. And St. Francis somehow gets a hold of the Gospel vernacular. He's going to hide it because, ooh, they're going to get him. Didn't happen. So that part of the movie, throw away. Actually, both those movies, throw away. Anyway, so we have that, the popularization of the Gospels in vernacular. Now, this group was condemned by Pope Lucius III in 1185 for preaching without permission. But they also had two teachings that were very, very heretical. The first one was that every true Christian who lives according to the gospel is a priest. Now, they didn't mean the priesthood of the people. They actually meant an ordained priest who can consecrate bread and wine to the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, and an ordained priest who could absolve sins. This is a heresy, The second thing they said, that any acts performed by an unworthy priest have no validity. So if a priest is in mortal sin, he celebrates Mass, they're saying that the body, blood, soul, divinity of Jesus doesn't happen. Transubstantiation doesn't happen. That's heretical. No matter the moral state of the priest, whenever he celebrates the Mass, having the intent of the church, the proper form and matter, the transubstantiation happens. So these were two heresies that they had, and so they were condemned. In 1218, they joined forces with the poor Lombards. Now, 1218 is 9 years after Francis began the order, so you see how long it continued. We have them beginning 1179 and going on into the early 13th century. So these poor Lombards, along with the Waldensians, were reacting to the scandalous clergy, and that won a lot of popularity among the people, because people were kind of tired of a clergy that wasn't praying, a clergy that was being scandalous in their behavior, and so people said, hey, yeah, I agree with that, because this clergy's a mess, That's kind of how it looked back then. And then the Craftsmen's Guild, they kind of were very accepting of the Waldensians and of the poor Lombards because, they had that critical view of the clergy. Now let's look at the second group here, the Cathars, or the Albigensians. Now, the Albigensians were an incredible, powerful, heretical group that spread, particularly throughout France. And St. Dominic Guzman founded his community in order to go after or to convert the Albigensians, or the Cathars, as they're also known. So they were scattered throughout the south of France and Lombardy. They held theological, philosophical faith based on a Manichaean dualism, Manichaeanism, which is an early heresy in the church. They denied several of the fundamental dogmas of Christianity. They rejected the Old Testament, and they abhorred all external forms of worship. Think about that. Abhorring the external forms of worship. What do we do as Catholics? We have an external form of worship. The Mass, the Divine Office, the Rosary, Benediction, so forth. They opposed it. Didn't want anything to do with it. And to reject the Old Testament, it's the inspired word of God, but they were saying, no, not going to take it, okay? And they were divided into two groups. There were the believers, and then there were the perfect. And the perfect made a show of rigid morality and extreme asceticism. And so, so again, they were denounced because of this. They were declared heretics because of these theological beliefs that they held, okay? Then we have the Humiliati, the third group, or the Humiliati of Lombardy. They were founded in 1178, and these were lay people who came together for daily work. So beginning of the the Autonomous Guild of Craftsmen. This is how that Autonomous Guild of Craftsmen began, were lay people coming together to try to work together and to live their faith together. Okay? So they began preaching in 1184, and they were lay people. And for this, they were excommunicated. Lay people were not permitted to preach, and so for that, they got excommunicated. Pope Innocent III, who was the pope who founded the Franciscan Friars, the Friars Minor, he reconciled this group to the church in 1201. And these were divided into three categories. So you had men and women who stayed in their homes. Then you had a communal group of men and women who were segregated but remained lay persons. And then you had a third group of clergy and laymen, which constituted a religious order. Now think about that. You have lay people in their homes, then men and women religious, and then priests and brothers. So you see the beginnings of the mendicant order with Francis, who will found the Poor Clare nuns, he'll found the friars, and he'll also found and be instrumental in the founding of the secular Franciscans during his own time, the three orders he founded. Now we move on to the Poor Catholics. Now the Poor Catholics comprised two groups. There was the one that was founded in the Kingdom of Aragon by Durando of Huesca, and then there was the one founded in Lombardy by Bernardo Primo. So you had the two groups of these Poor Catholics. Now Durando of Huesca was converted by St. Dominic Guzman in 1207. And Durando had been a Waldensian. So he devoted himself to combating heresy by scholarship and evangelical poverty. So he was trying to combat heresy by evangelical poverty and scholarship. You see, the Dominican influence there. So this new brotherhood was approved by Pope Innocent III in 1208, 1 year before St. Francis. So you see, Pope Innocent was really a pope who was looking forward to the renewal of the church and was looking for the Holy Spirit's working in various people's lives in bringing about the renewal of the church. Now, the rule of the group founded by Bernardo Primo was approved in 1210, 1 year after St. Francis. Now, let's look at the church during Francis's time. We see this movement going on, this return to gospel poverty, this desire to go back to the scriptures, this desire to go back to the early days of the apostles during the apostolic time and how early Christians lived. But let's all look at the church at Francis's time. So, it was deeply imbued with feudalism and shaped by German system of benefices. It took an important step away from civil power under Pope Gregory VII and became profoundly secularized. There was a lot of secularization going on during the time of Francis with the clergy. A lot of the bishops were becoming feudal lords. They became powerful with the money. We mentioned Bishop Guido, who was the bishop over Assisi, who was the most powerful man in Assisi, the most powerful feudal lord, and the wealthiest man in Assisi as well. Now, Pope Innocent III was elected in 1198. That's 11 years before Francis founded the order. Now, he was deeply aware of his position as head of the city of God on earth. And he recognized the supremacy of the priesthood over the empire. Because the Holy Roman Empire was Catholic, as the Pope, he saw himself as having the authority over these emperors and over these lands in a moral way, but also in a temporal way. And he was, in fact, the most powerful Pope in the history of the Church. So he saw the subordination of temporal authority to spiritual authority. And he used it in the right way. So he wasn't like a bad guy, trying to force, the church over the state. He was actually a very good and holy man who was seeking the conversion of all peoples. So he was also aware of his role as supreme pontiff, as supreme pastor. He saw himself responsible for the reform in the church. And he followed every sign of the workings of the Spirit. Now, what was the condition of monastic life during the time of Francis? So for 6 centuries, Benedictine abbeys shaped European society. The regular pattern of worship and the regular pattern of work kind of set the tone and the shape of the culture. From the 10th to the 12th century, there was the reforms of the monastic orders, especially in Cluny and Citeaux. In Cluny, That monastery was distinguished by the magnificence of liturgy and art, social influence, and intellectual labor. And then over at Citeaux, there was the emphasis on the simple, austere living, its rule of perpetual silence and more subjective piety. And we'll see particularly Citeaux and the spirituality burden of Clairvaux has a very large impact on St. Francis himself. Now, other religious orders during this time. We have the eremitical community springing up. So the Camaldolese hermits were founded in 1012 by St. Romuald. We have the Vallombrosa, founded in 1028. The Carthusians were founded by St. Bruno in 1084. The Grand Mont, founded in 1099. Fontevraud, founded in 1101. And so you have this incredible renewal of religious life happening a century before Francis, and it comes into full fluster during the time of Francis. Now, the regular clergy adopted the Augustinian rule for communal life. They lived under a common roof, they had a common table and common prayer. So many diocesan priests were adopting St. Augustine's rule as their way of life. And Francis, Augustine wrote that rule for his diocesan priest, partially. So the Cenobitic life, mixed with pastoral care, was brought into being through the premonstrances of St. Norbert, or we call them today the Norbertines, and they were founded in 1119. Now let's look at the Franciscan Orders near Assisi. I think we can mop this up in the little time we have left. So there were monastic orders in and near Assisi. The Benedictine monks of Monte Sabasio, which is the mountain right next to Assisi, is San Benedetto of San Sabasio. They own the Porziuncula. This is the monastery that Francis brought the fish to when he rented the Porziuncula. And they first took Francis in as a servant in the kitchen, and then they would give him a second tunic. He had to leave. We'll see that later. So the monastery was destroyed in 1399 while Assisi was at war with Perugia. Then there was St. Pietro Monastery. Not the church rebuilt by St. Francis. This was a monastery. Very wealthy, once owned the property where now stands the Basilica and the Sacro Convento. So where St. Francis Basilica is, at the edge of Assisi, that was owned by St. Pietro's Monastery, given to Assisi for Francis's Basilica. Then near the banks of the river, there was St. Victorinus, near where St. Victorinus was beheaded, there was a very early Benedictine monastery, which was gone by the time of St. Francis. But its stones were used in the 16th century to build the basilica over the Porziuncula. So there was the layout of the old stones were lying there. The monastery was destroyed. So when they built Francis's the basilica over the Porziuncula and protected the little church, they used the stones from that old monastery. Now there were 3 Benedictine convents for women. San Donato, beyond the Tessio River, on the hill at the edge of the woods, now belonged to the Sacro Convento. In the 14th century, it was transferred into the church of San Giacomo inside the city. Then Santa Apollinare, and no trace of the original building is even left. In the 15th century, it united with San Paolo's with the walls of Assisi. Now, St. Paolo Monastery, this offered the first asylum to St. Clare. Only the church remains, and it was transferred into the city. Other convents for women, Santa Maria delle Episcopi, Santa Nessa, Santa Croce, and so forth. Then there's Ponzo, situated just below the Carceri, the richest and most influential convent, and Clara and Agnes took refuge here just before moving to San Damiano's. Now, other Benedictine churches, the Prior of San Bartolomeo, San Giovanni de Beviglie, the Monastery of Farfa. The model of life to all Benedictine monasteries of Assisi was in Farfa. A great contribution to the foundation of the Church of San Giacomo, assisted in attaining San Giorgio's for the construction of Clare's Basilica. Then there was St. Niccolo de Campolgo and San Benedetto of San Triano. So these are, if you see, Assisi was surrounded by Benedictine monks and Benedictine nuns. So, you can see the religious influence on Francis and on Clare and those who came from Assisi. It was truly a very spiritual place with many monasteries for both monks and for nuns, and soon to be the home of the Friars Minor and the Poor Clares, and of course the birth of the Second Franciscan Order. And we'll pick up in our next class, we'll begin with the birth and early life of St. Francis. May God bless you and may it keep you.